Shavua Tov, everyone. Today we're going to be learning Pesachim Daf Ayin Chet. This week of learning has been sponsored in memory of Arthur Levy, Avram ben El Yakum on his third year at site, from his daughters Linda, Marcia, Marilyn, and Barbara, and for their beloved Opa from his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And the week of learning is also sponsored by Ruth Rotenberg in memory of her daughter, Taniel Gavria Margalit. And yesterday's Daf Ayin Zayin, Oz, was dedicated by Shelley and Jerry Gornish in memory of our Oz, our beloved and missed grandson, Oz Wilczek. Zichrono Livracha. We're going to start from Ayin Chet at the very top. What we did yesterday, if you got to yesterday's Daf, so we had the Mishnah, Chamisha Dvarim Ba'im B'tumah Be'en Nechalim B'tumah. There are 5 korbanot that can be brought, even though the people are Tme'im, but not eaten. You can't eat them. So then we had an entire Amud all about could this Mishnah be not in line, or it looks like it's not in line with Rabbi Yoshua, to which they eventually explained it actually is in line with Rabbi Yoshua. And we talked about this big machlok at Rabbi Yoshua and Rabbi Eliezer. Can you sprinkle the blood or throw the blood on the altar even if the meat is no longer there? Rabbi Yoshua said you can't if the meat is problematic, whether it's tameh, impure, or lost, or burnt. Rabbi Yoshua said no way. And Rabbi Eliezer said you could. And then we had a whole question, how to match Rabbi Yoshua with the Mishnah, and eventually they came up with an answer. Now the Gemara is going to do the same thing with Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi. Why don't we suggest that our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yossi? Why? Now this is something we saw in the daf yesterday. Titanya, as it says in the following Braita, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Hatzitz meratzeh al achilot. Rabbi Yossi Omer, ein hatzitz meratzeh al achilot. So Rabbi Eliezer says, the tzitz atones. Remember, the tzitz is this plate a head plate that the Kohen Gadol wore on his head, and it was there to atone for tuma, for impurity in the temple. So the question is, how far does the atonement go? So according to Rabbi Eliezer, it even permits meat to be eaten. Not only that you can sprinkle the blood on the altar, also you can eat the meat. But Rabbi Yossi, and this is what we're dealing with, we want to figure out here, says ein hatzitz meratzeh al achilot. So now, the first assumption of the Gemara is to say, kasal kadatach, we're assuming that minta ka'amar Rabbi Yossi ein hatzitz meratzeh al achilot, ke Rabbi Yoshua svira le de'amar be'inan tarte. The fact that he says that the tzitz does not atone for eating, what would be the relevance of eating if not to say that if, in other words, on the food, what's the relevance of saying it doesn't atone for the food? It's to tell you, well, since it doesn't atone for the food, that must be telling you that you cannot put the blood on the altar. Now that's Rabbi Yoshua's opinion, that in ein dam, ein basar, ein dam. Remember, if there's no blood, you can't eat the meat. And if you don't have the meat, then you can't sprinkle the blood. So we're now going to assume, there's an assumption they're going to break in a minute, but they're going to assume, since he says ein hatzitz meratzeh al achilot, it must be, those two must be connected. Because why else would you need it to tell you? Well, we'll see why else. But right now they're thinking, why else would you need to know that it doesn't atone for the food, if not to know that, well, since it doesn't atone for the food, that means you can't put the blood on the altar because your food is problematic, and ein basar, ein dam, and that's Rabbi Yoshua. So now, where does that take us to our Mishnah? Well, then our Mishnah, according to him, if you can't eat the food, and then you can't bring the blood, then how on earth could these be brought b'tumah but not eaten? If they can't be eaten, then they shouldn't be able, ein basar, ein dam. So it must be the Mishnah doesn't match Rabbi Yossi. To which the Gemara answers, no, not necessarily. Oh, so first they say, they just repeat. So ne'ema hashtam anitin deloka Rabbi Yossi. So it seems like our Mishnah doesn't follow his opinion. So now the Gemara says, lo, you don't have to necessarily say that he holds like Rabbi Yoshua. You could say, yeah, the tzitz doesn't atone for the food, which would exactly match our Mishnah. You can't eat the food. However, you could still put the blood on the altar. Why is that? Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Eliezer, svira le de'amal, dam afa pi she'en basar. No, we could hold, you could put the blood on the altar, even though the meat is no longer. So they say, wait a minute. Ihachi, and this goes back to what we assumed before. So what's it coming to tell you then? Right? Just that you can't eat it, they don't think that's enough. They think that it's more than just, okay, you can't eat the meat. So they say, wait a minute. If you're saying this whole issue of is the tzitz meratzeh and achilot or not is all because if it's not, you can't put the blood on the altar, well, then I'm going to flip the question back at you. Litamech, according to that logic, that these are interconnected, Rabbi Eliezer da'amar hatzitz meratzeh. Now, what's Rabbi Eliezer's shita? The tzitz atones for, right, this head plate atones for the food. Well, according to him, kevan amar dam afal pisha em basal hatzitz moratzel achilot lamay hilchata. According to Rabbi Eliezer, if these things are interconnected, and he already holds that you can put the blood on the altar, even if your blood is in the meat becomes impure, well, then he doesn't even need to tell you hatzitz moratzel achilot, because you can even put the blood even if the tzitz doesn't atone for the food. So therefore, clearly these two things are not connected, because if they were, he'd have no point to even weigh in on this argument. The whole point was, does the tzitz atone for the meat so that you can sprinkle the blood, and those are interconnected, then there'd be no point for Rabbi Eliezer to even say this. And therefore, it must be this machloket about is the dam meratzeh, is the tzitz meratzeh, does it atone for food, has to do with something else. What is that? The whole machloket has to do with two other halachic issues, pigul and me'ilah. So let's review these concepts. Pigul is when a kohen who's sacrificing, while he's, or even the slaughterer, which doesn't have to be a kohen, while they're slaughtering or while they're sprinkling the blood, they have a thought that whoever's doing the action has a thought that they're going to either, while they're slaughtering, that they're going to sprinkle the blood, or they're going to burn the stuff on the altar or eat the food at the wrong time. Actually, I'm not sure if it's sprinkling, but definitely eating the food or burning it on the altar at the wrong time or outside the right place. They're going to do it outside the temple, let's say. Then the meat becomes pigul. Now you're only chayav karet, if you recall, only if it's outside of the right time and not outside of the right place. Anyway, that meat is called pigul. If you eat that meat, you get karet. Okay, again, if it's chutz limkomo, outside of the place, you get karet. That's one halacha. So now we learned already also that it's only pigul that you'll get karet if the korban is perfectly fine otherwise. That the only reason why eating this is problematic is because it's pigul. But in this case, it's going to depend, right? If, let's say, if you say that tzitz is miratzeh, then, sorry, maybe I confused it. Let me just clarify. Time is the one that gets you karet. Location is the one that doesn't get you karet. Okay, it's still pigul, but you don't have karet for eating the meat. But if it's time, chutz lizmano, outside of the right time, you're going to get pigul. So now, what do they say here? This machloket is all about whether you're going to get pigul or me'ilah, which I'll get to in a minute. So let's just start with the pigul. Rabbi Eliezer saval meratzeh tzitz ilave. The tzitz atones. So I brought meat. The meat became impure. We put the blood on the altar, and then we continued on, and we had a pigul thought while things were going on. Okay, let's say while they slaughtered it or something, had a pigul thought. Now, if that's the case, so the tzitz takes care of the tumah, which means that the meat is fine to be eaten, which means, according to Rabbi Eliezer, who's lenient about this, is going to be stringent about pigul. It's going to be pigul because the korban is perfectly fine otherwise. Okay, so meshave le kitahor, the tzitz comes, turns it into tahor. It's as if it was pure. V'kavale bepigul. Okay, and now it will be pigul. What about me'ilah before we go on? Okay, obviously Rabbi Yeshua will say the opposite. Me'ilah is misuse of consecrated property. Now, when you have a korban, let's say a korban shlamim is eaten by the owners, which means there's no me'ilah in a korban shlamim, but there's me'ilah earlier on, in the early stage. Once it's sanctified, until you put the blood on the altar, it's forbidden to be eaten. It has a law of me'ilah. Once you permit the food for being eaten by sprinkling the blood on the altar or throwing it, or depending on the case, then what happens? The me'ilah basically disappears. Okay? So there's no me'ilah anymore because it's permitted to you. However, in a case, now we're going to see. So according to Rabbi Eliezer, since the tzitz comes and the tzitz is miratzeh, and since the tzitz is miratzeh, what happens? The meat becomes pure. If it's pure, then it becomes permitted to eat, which means there's no more laws of me'ilah on this piece of meat. So on the one hand, it has a stringency that it will be pigul because everything else was fine. And therefore, if someone has a pigul thought, they're going to mess up the korban. But assuming that didn't happen, then there's not going to be a law of me'ilah anymore. The Rabbi Yossi Savar, what did Rabbi Yossi hold? Rabbi Yossi holds lo meratzeh tzitzi lavei. Now remember, Rabbi Yossi holds that, sorry, did I say Rabbi Yeshua before? I meant Rabbi Yossi. got confused. Rabbi Yossi holds, lo meratzeh tzitzi labe, v'lo meshave le ketahor, v'lo kavale bepigo, v'lo mapik le midei me'ila. What does he say? He says the opposite. He says, listen, it's not meratzeh an achilot, which again means this has nothing to do with Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer before, dam off pishein basar, basar off pishein dam. It's a totally separate issue. The issue is the meat is still impure. If the meat is impure, there's no laws of pigul. Number one. Number two, this meat continues to have the status of me'ila because it's never permitted to be eaten. So if anyone were to use it, they'd be liable for misuse of consecrated property. Okay, those are the two relevancies to that argument. Okay, so where did we start? We tried to say our Mishnah isn't like Rabbi Yossi. We said, no, you could say because he must hold like Rabbi Yeshua. In the end, we say, no, our Mishnah could be like Rabbi Yossi because he could hold like Rabbi Eliezer, who holds dam afal pi she'ein basal. Okay, so now, matkifla Rav Meri. Rav Meri doesn't like this answer that our Mishnah matches Rabbi Yossi because he says, Nihi nami to Rabbi Yossi, sever like Rabbi Eliezer. Now you might say he holds like Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, fine, I'll accept that. Still, you can't fit the Mishnah in with him. Why is that? Bishlama. Now remember the cases in our Mishnah. We had a few cases of mincha offerings, meal offerings, and we had a few cases of sacrifices. So bishlama zvachim ikadam. Okay, now what did he say? Rabbi Yossi said, Ein hatzitz meratzeh al achilot. It doesn't atone for food. So when it comes to sacrifices, it makes sense. You can bring the sacrifice, just you can't eat the meat because it doesn't atone for the meat. So what do? So you bring the blood. That's fine. Your sacrifice works. Omer, the Korbana Omer also, you could explain it. How so? What can you bring if you can't eat it? Well, there's the kmitza. Remember, the Kohen takes a part of it with his 3 middle fingers and he burns that on the altar. That you could do. The tzitz is meratzeh on that. It's just not meratzeh on the shirayim. The leftovers, which the Kohen's supposed to eat, he won't be able to eat. So, Omer nami ika kometz. Lechem apanim. The lechem apanim is the bread. Theoretically, you would think, well, you can't eat that. So what does it mean to bring the lechem apanim? Well, if you remember, there's these bizichim. There's bowls, 2 bowls they would bring with the 12 loaves, and they would have frankincense in them. And at the end of the week, when they removed the bread, they removed these bowls, and they would offer them as like a type of ketoret. Okay, they would burn them. So lechem apanim nami ika bizichim. So all those have situations where something can be sacrificed, so to speak, right? It's not exactly typical sacrifice in all these cases, but some process can happen. So therefore they can be brought b'tumah, but not eaten. So you can't eat the bread, you can't eat, right? All those things, you can't eat the mincha offering, but you can bring part of it. But what's the problem in the Mishnah? Ela shtei alechem ma'ika lememar. But the 2 loaves that are brought with these kivsei atzeret, which are the sheep that you bring on Shavuot, 2 sheep and 2 loaves. The 2 loaves, no part of them is offered. They all get eaten. So what's Rabbi Yossi going to say if he says, according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's fine because hatzitz meratzeh lo chalim, you can even eat the shtei alechem, and therefore they can be brought. Or you can't, right? Well, then we said you can't exactly eat them. But in any case, we're going to say this Mishnah makes no sense according to Rabbi Yossi, because nothing can be offered with them. If you want to say, well, it's the fact that you can bring the kivsei atzeret along with them, but then in ken havalu arba'ah, but the kivsei atzeret, remember, are mentioned separately in the Mishnah. The Mishnah said there's 5 things, and what are they? The omer, the shtei alechem, the lechem apanim, the zivchei shalmei tzibor, and the sirei v'shei chodashim. So the shtei alechem is mentioned separately from the zivchei shalmei tzibor. First of all, they're even separated with something in between them. It'd be weird to think they came together. And the Mishnah said there's 5 things, and then listed 5 things. If you want to say, well, the kivsei atzeret are the parts that are offered, and the shtei alechem just can't be eaten, but then it should have said that, right? It should have been only 4. That should be one and the same. And even though, if you remember, we said the Shalmei Tzibor are referring to the Sireizim that were brought l'chatat, the Gemara said, but they meant there, in addition to the Kivsei Atzeret, we also have the Sireizim l'chatat, and that's all considered one. So it doesn't make, the Shtei Alechem really doesn't fit in with Rabbi Yossi, and therefore we must say, Ela kasava Rabbi Yossi tum'ahu tra b'tzibor. So we'll give a different answer. Forget about what we said before. Okay, if he really thought Tuma is dechuya and you need the tzitz to be meratzeh, this Mishnah doesn't match him because he doesn't think that tzitz atones for the food, and the only thing in the Shtei Alechem is the eating, and therefore it doesn't make any sense. So therefore, they assume second way to resolve Rabbi Yossi with our Mishnah is to say, maybe he holds Tuma hutra b'tzibur. Remember that whole discussion? Is Tuma entirely permitted? Meaning that if there's a korban tzibur, a public sacrifice that has to be brought, and the meat becomes tameh, we don't care. Tuma is entirely overridden, meaning you don't need the tzitz. And that's why our Mishnah matches Rabbi Yossi, because according to Rabbi Yossi, you don't need the tzitz at all. And therefore, it doesn't matter that the tzitz only partially atones. In a case of a tzibur, when would you need the tzitz then? In an individual offering, but not in a tzibur offering. But what's the problem? If you really hold, we're now going to basically prove from somewhere else that Rabbi Yossi is mentioned, which has to do with Yom Kippur and the Kohen Gadol before Yom Kippur. It's clear that he doesn't hold Tumah hutra b'tzibur, and you'll see why in a minute, in which case we're going to end up coming to the conclusion that our Mishnah clearly doesn't match Rabbi Yossi. Okay, unlike yesterday, where we somehow found a way to fit Rabbi Yeshua in with the Mishnah, here we really can't. So let's see why. Hatanya, it says in a Braita. Now, the Kohen Gadol, the 7 days before Yom Kippur, if you remember, he has to separate from his wife, and he has to be extra careful. And then, according to this machloket, they would also be concerned that maybe, we don't know, but maybe he passed by some grave that we don't know about, and maybe he's a tamei meith. So he would undergo a process to purify him from maybe that he was near a dead person. So there's a debate about how they do this. They take the Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippurim, they take the mechatat from the parah adumah they kept from the time of Moshe, and they would mix it with their most latest batch of mechatat, and they would take some from both, and they would use that and sprinkle it on the Kohen Gadol the 7 days, every single day. Now, normally when you become tamei meith, we do it on day number 3 and day number 7. Why would they do it every day here? Because this is all suffix, we don't know. So any day could possibly be the 3rd day and the 7th day. So we basically sprinkle every day in case maybe he was tamei a few days before. And then this would be, day number 1 would be his day number 3 to his tuma. And then, right, and so on. So basically, every day of that week, they would sprinkle the mechatat on the Kohen Gadol. That's divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Yossi, which is our important person, Omer, ein mazim alav ela shlishi u'shvi'i bilvad. You would only sprinkle on him on day number 3 and day number 7. In other words, the assumption is, let's assume maybe the last day he was tamei. We don't need to do it every single day. Okay, so this is the parah adumah. What the mechatat is made from the parah adumah. I'm not sure about your question, but this is the parah adumah waters that they're using, okay, to sprinkle on him. So they would do it on the 3rd day and the 7th day, and that was sufficient. Now, what's going on here? This is all suffix, maybe he was tamei. Now, if Rabbi Yossi really holds that, if he holds that what? That Tumah hutra b'tzibur, okay, isal kadatach, if you're going to think, the kasavar Rabbi Yossi, Tumah hutra b'tzibur, lama li haza aklal, what do you need to do this sprinkling for? Meaning, Tumah hutra b'tzibur, worst case, if really there's some tumah we don't know about, and obviously if he's tamei, we're gonna send him to get purified. But if we don't know, are we going to start suggesting, oh, let's do this, let's do that? Doesn't make any sense. So therefore, it must be that Rabbi Yossi does not hold tumah hutra b'tzibur, and therefore we're going to say, ela mechuvarta matnitin dilo keRabbi Yossi. It seems like our Mishnah is not keRabbi Yossi. Okay, what they mean, echad zeh v'echad zeh, I saw you ask the question. Echad zeh is the Kohen Gadol and Yom Kippurim, or it's also the Kohen who burns the parah adumah. Okay, both of them need, it's also, maybe that's what you were asking, Eric. I didn't follow your question. It's also the Kohen who's burning the parah adumah also needs to separate 7 days before, just in case. Okay, so these are 2 people that we're talking about. Sorry that I didn't clarify that before. And in the end, we're going to say our Mishnah doesn't match Rabbi Yossi, so that's the end of that. Now we're going back to something that we saw yesterday. If you lived in suspense all night and didn't know what was going on here, we saw this very weird Braita where Rabbi Yossi says, I hold like Rabbi Eliezer and I hold like Rabbi Yeshua in Zvachim and in Menachot. And basically he holds like Rabbi Eliezer, in Basa, you can do the dam even if you don't have the meat. And he holds like Rabbi Yeshua that if you don't have the meat, you can't do the dam. And if you don't have the dam, you can't do the basar. How could he possibly hold like both? And that's where we're going to start. So Amalei Rav Papa Labai. We're going back to that Braita and we just want to explain it. Rav Papa says to Abai, if Rabbi Yossi, Shtara Mezake Lebeit Trehu, what does he give? It's like as if two people came to court before him and said, hey, this is mine. And someone else said, this is mine. And he basically said, you're right and you're right, which can't possibly be. Okay, it's not possible. It's either mine or it's yours. It can't be both of ours. So how could he be basically mizaket, to give the shtar to both people? Okay, doesn't make any sense. Ditanya, as it says in the Braita, we'll just reread the Braita, which says exactly what I just said. I see his opinion about zvachim, about sacrifice, and I see also his opinion. And also when it comes to meal offerings, I see his opinion and I see his opinion. How do I hold like him? You can sprinkle the blood even if you don't have the meat. And also, like Rabbi Yeshua says, you can't do it without both. The comparison to blood and meat is the kometz, the kmitza, the part that the kohen sticks his 3 middle fingers in and burns on the altar. That part can be brought even if there's no leftovers, if the leftovers became impure, got lost, burned, something like that. And I agree with Rabbi Yeshua who says, I also agree with Rabbi Yeshua says if you don't have the kometz, you can't eat the shirayim. And if you don't have the shirayim, the leftovers you can't eat, you can't burn the kometz. So this makes absolutely no sense. So Rav Papa says that to Abaye, and Abaye answers him, what he said was, it makes sense to me. And what makes sense? When he made a statement about sacrifice, remember, he made a statement about sacrifices and he made a statement about meal offerings. So when he was talking about sacrifices, what he meant to say is, just like they argue in zvachim, they must also argue in menachot. And when he was in menachot, when he was talking, they assumed that these two statements were made when, one day he was teaching zvachim, one day he was teaching menachot. When he was teaching menachot and he got to the machloket, he said, oh, and by the way, it seems logical to me, just like they argue about menachot like this, they must also argue about zvachim, about the same thing. Well, Rav Papa doesn't like this answer, as you could probably imagine why. Amarle, hatinach, I understand your first argument. When he was standing in zvachim, and he said, look, it seems to me they argue about menachot, the same issue. I get that. The ikar cry, and why is that? Because the main pasuk, the main pasuk was talking about sacrifices. And where they learn it from, remember? It's all talking about sacrifices, no blood and meal offerings. So I get that you're saying, okay, they argue about this in zvachim, we can apply that to menachot. But it makes no sense to say, listen, just like they argue in menachot, mistabra means I'm going to assume that they also argue in zvachim. That's not an assumption. That's obvious. The whole pasuk was about that. Ha'ikar cry b'zvachim hu diktive. And therefore, I don't like your answer. So he knocks out his answer. And now it's not exactly clear. I mean, you can look in commentaries, different people say different things. Not exactly clear who's speaking now. Okay, but now that either the Gemara is talking and brings an answer, or maybe Rav Papa brings his own answer, or maybe Abai, we don't know, but we're going to have a number of resolutions here. Okay, there's going to be, so we had Abai's resolution, which Rav Papa knocked out. And now we're going to have 3 more resolutions. Only the last one is going to stand the test. So here goes our 3 options. Ela lo kasha. So, okay, let's explain it a different way. Remember we talked about there's a difference between nitma, if it became impure, and a difference between avud v'saruf. Now, why is that? There's really 2 reasons. Mara's going to focus on one. One is that nitma is here, it's just problematic, whereas avav and nisraf is gone entirely. So therefore, and the other reason is, benitma, you can say that the tzitz is miratzeh, and therefore it's okay. Whereas avuv v'saruf, we don't have such thing as the tzitz atones, and it's as if the meat's here. No, the meat's gone. So therefore, what he's saying is, I agree with Rabbi Eliezer when it comes to a case where the meat became impure. Then you can do the blood anyway, because we're going to be more lenient there. But divrei Rabbi Yeshua ba'avav v'saruf, I'm going to distinguish though, if it got lost or burnt, then I'm going to hold that no, you can't do the blood. So now the Gemara questions this and says, wait, again, it's not sure who questions, but let's just say the Gemara for right now. Benitma my time, mishum timiratze tzitz, right? Isn't it because the tzitz is miratze, and that's the reason? And now, who's the author of this Braita, if you can remember? Rabbi Yossi. Now, what does Rabbi Yossi say? Remember, if it's because of the Ritzoy Tzitz, and really he holds like Rabbi Yeshua that im ein basar ein dam, but because the tzitz is miratzeh, we do have basar, but you can't say that about Rabbi Yossi because Hashama leila Rabbi Yossi damar ein tzitz miratzeh alachilot. Remember, he's the guy who says, started with that today, that tzitz doesn't atone for the food, which means this is a case where ein basal, even if nitma, even if it's still in existence, it's as if it's not in existence because it's still tameh, and therefore, if he holds like Rabbi Yeshua, if it had a vu b'saruf, you should hold like Rabbi Yeshua here too, that in ein basal ein dam. Ella, so that answer doesn't work. Ella lo kasha. Like we tried to distinguish with Rabbi Yeshua before. Actually, we concluded that Rabbi Yeshua distinguishes between individual offerings and communal offerings. That was our last answer about Rabbi Yeshua. So why don't we say that that's what he means? He's basically saying, I hold like, now this would, by the way, contradict the conclusion of the previous sugya, because the previous sugya we said even Rabbi Yeshua himself distinguishes. Here you'd have to assume, no, they still argue. And he holds like Rabbi Eliezer when it comes to communal offerings, will be lenient and allow you to sprinkle the blood. But he holds like Rabbi Yeshua when it comes to individual offerings, and we don't allow you to sprinkle the blood. But then they say, wait a minute, my time, b'tzibor, my time, mishum de tumahutra b'tzibor. What would be the only reason why we'd be lenient and allow you to do the blood? Because you'd have to say, remember, if you say tuma dechuya, and you hold like Rabbi Eliezer that ein hatzitz meratzah ochalin, then even in a communal offering, the tzitz is not meratzah on food. So you'd have to say what? You'd have to say the reason why is because tuma hutra b'tzibor. It's entirely pushed aside, meaning there's no tuma at all, and therefore it's as if you have basal. But that's problematic for a few reasons. Chada, number one, we already said earlier today that what? Deshama leila Rabbi Yossi damar tuma dechuyu b'tzibor, with the kohen gadol and the kohen that's burning the parah aduma. What did we say? He doesn't hold tuma hutra because he thinks that even in a tzibor offering, you have to worry about possible tuma. So therefore, that wouldn't work. Ve'od, and secondly, ibet tzibor, Rabbi Eliezer machshir v'lo Rabbi Yeshua, ha'amart b'tzibor afilu Rabbi Yeshua modeh. And it's exactly what I said before, which is we already came to the conclusion at the very top of Ayin Chadam Aleph, which I taught in yesterday's daf, which is that Rabbi Yeshua himself distinguishes between individual and he himself agrees. He distinguishes between communal and individual. He himself agrees that when it comes to communal, it's okay. You don't need the basar. So you can't say that Rabbi Yossi is saying, I hold like Rabbi Eliezer when it comes to communal and not like Rabbi Yeshua, because Rabbi Yeshua himself agrees when it comes to communal, it's okay. So that doesn't work. So last answer, although we'll have a question on it and have to answer it, but we will. We'll come up with an answer. This sounds very similar to the end of yesterday's sugya, right? Where we tried to say maybe that's Rabbi Yeshua's distinction. Is it b'diavad lechatchila? Is it tzibor yachid? So now they say what Rabbi Yossi was saying is, I agree with Rabbi Eliezer b'diavad if it was already done, but I agree with Rabbi Yeshua if you're standing there and you know the meat became impure, and since the tzitz is not miratzeh, then we don't allow you to do it. Okay. So therefore, that's his distinction. So now they question it and say, wait a minute. But didn't we learn yesterday that Rabbi Yeshua admits when it comes to b'diavad that it's okay? Dekatane, as it says in a Braita, modeh Rabbi Yeshua she'im sarah kurtza. He agreed with Rabbi Eliezer that if you already did it, it's fine, it works. So how could he say then, I agree with Rabbi Yeshua, right? Lechatchila, but not b'diavad. When b'diavad, he agrees with Rabbi Eliezer. Or how could he say, I paskin like Rabbi Eliezer b'diavad, when Rabbi Yeshua agrees with that, and there's no machloket. Again, for someone to say, I agree with him, I side with him, it must mean the other person disagrees. So what do they answer? They now make this other distinction. Again, we're combining a whole bunch of things that we've said. That Braita, where Modeh Rabbi Yeshua, she'im zara kurtza, is not said in the Tuma case. We're now going to say, ha betuma, ha ba'ava v'saruf. Okay, so now we're going to say, sorry, it's the opposite. He is saying it only in that case. Ki katane modeh Rabbi Yeshua she'im zara kurtza binitma. When he says that b'diavad, I'm going to allow this, is in a case of tuma. Because remember, we're always more lenient when it comes to something being impure because the meat is still there. But aval ba'avad v'saruf lo. Okay, and then, so how does this work? So the whole thing is we brought in this question that b'diavad, even Rabbi Yeshua agrees, but no, b'diavad, our topic is tuma. When that Braita said b'diavad, Rabbi Yeshua agrees, it's going to be talk. I'm sorry, say it again. When Rabbi Yeshua says that braita, he means in a tumah case, but not of a v'saruf. And now we're going to say our issue is ki ka'ama Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yossi talked about this braita. He wasn't talking about tumah like we thought all along. He's talking about ba'aviv v'saruf. He's talking about if it got burnt or lost, then I'm going to hold b'di'evet like Rabbi Eliezer, because in that case, Rabbi Yeshua doesn't think b'di'evet it's okay. There, Rabbi Yeshua will say, you have to have the meat, it's no good. And comes Rabbi Yossi to say, I hold like Rabbi Eliezer there. I think even there, b'di'evet, it's okay. But l'chatchila, I'm going to hold like Rabbi Yeshua. That l'chatchila, if you're standing there and you haven't yet done anything and you know that the meat is either impure, lost, or burnt, I'm not going to let you do it. Okay? So that's in the end the way we explain it, that the difference between what he means, I hold like Rabbi Eliezer, what he means is b'di'evet. And I hold like Rabbi Yeshua, l'chatchila. So if you're standing there and you know, no good. But if you've already done it, then I hold like Rabbi Eliezer. Now, what ends up in the end is that both Rabbi Yeshua and Rabbi Eliezer agree that if it became tameh, the meat, and you sprinkle the blood anyway, b'di'evet, it's okay. But when Rabbi Yossi says, I hold like Rabbi Eliezer, he means only in the case where it was lost or burnt. Okay, and that's how we conclude. And that's how we finally understood that confusing braita. So the two things so far that we did today, just to review, we tried to suggest that maybe our Mishnah could fit in with Rabbi Yossi, who holds ein hatzitz martzah lo chalin. In the end, we couldn't do that. We had to say our Mishnah doesn't match him really because of the issue with the shtei alechem. Then that was the whole first section. The whole second section was just trying to understand this braita, which we brought a whole number of suggestions, how we could hold both like Rabbi Yeshua and like Rabbi Yossi, how we could hold both like Rabbi Yeshua and like Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yossi. And then we said Rabbi Yossi must hold like Rabbi Eliezer b'di'evet and like Rabbi Yeshua l'chatchila. And again, the b'di'evet is only in the case of Avav v'saruf. It would be in the case of everything really, but it's like Rabbi Eliezer when it comes to Avav v'saruf, because even Rabbi Yeshua will agree when it comes to nitma. Okay, now we're moving on to a new Mishnah. Nitma basar v'chelev kayam. So again, we're getting into more detail here. Before we just said you can't eat the meat. Now we're talking about there's two parts, right? We were discussing it certainly on the side here about ein basar, ein dam, ein basal. Now we're going to talk about what if you have part of the meat. Okay, there's two parts to the meat. There's the parts that get burnt on the altar, and there's the parts that the owners eat. Certainly when it comes to a korban pesach and many other sacrifices. So, right, other than the korban ola, which all gets burnt. So what if, now what we're going to, usually we call them imurim. In this case, we're going to call them the chelev, because the chelev is one of the parts that gets burnt on the altar. It's the fats that get burned on the altar, which is the same fats that we're not allowed to eat on regular animals. It's connected because it gets sacrificed. When it's sacrificed, it gets burnt to God. So we're also not allowed to eat it in regular animals, which is why, by the way, I'll just keep repeating this every time we learn it because it's good and it helps get into your head, which is why chelev only happens to be forbidden for animals that are domesticated animals and not undomesticated animals. Okay, like it's for sheep and lamb and cattle, because those are animals that were offered on the altar. No one ever brought a ram, not a ram, what I want to say, a chamor, a donkey, let's say, okay? Nobody ever brought that on the, right, and the deer, that's what I was thinking of, and the deer, okay? Those weren't ever brought on the altar, so therefore their chelev is not forbidden. So it's all interconnected. It's a good way to remember, because dam is a problem in everything, but chelev is only a problem there. Okay, nitma basar v'chelev kayam, eno zoreket hadam. If the meat became impure, but the chelev is still existing, in other words, meaning it didn't become impure, then, now we're talking, first of all, they don't tell you this, but it's obvious from the continuation, they're talking only about the korban pesach now. So if the meat became impure, which means you can't eat the meat. Now remember, what did we learn in the previous Mishnah? The whole point of the korban pesach is to eat the meat. So if the meat became impure, but the chelev is still existing and you can burn those fats on the altar, but you can't eat it, eino zoreket hadam, because again, the korban pesach is all about eating the sacrifice. Nimtza chelev babasar kayam, if it's the reverse though, nitma chelev, I said the wrong thing. Nitma, if the chelev is impure and the meat is in existence, then zoreket hadam. Ube mukdashim eino kain, but it's not the same for all other sacrifices. That's how we know they were talking only about the Pesach. Ela afa pisha nitma basar v'chelev kayam zoreket hadam. Even though the basar becomes impure, if the chelev is still in existence, as long as one of them is in existence, you can still sprinkle the blood. This is obviously according to those who say you need both. So now, Amar Rav Gidol Amar Rav. Rav comes and says, but by the way, this is only lechatchila. Im zarak hurtza. If you already sprinkled the blood in the korban pesach, even though your meat was impure, it's okay. Your korban is good. So this is very surprising. Didn't we say, right? Habi'ina nachila. But don't you need to eat it? Didn't we say that's such an important element of the korban pesach? So how could he possibly say this? So he answers, achila lo ma'akva. No, it's not ma'akev, right? Ma'akev means it doesn't prevent you from fulfilling the mitzvah. It's important, but it's not the end all be all. So they say, what do you mean? V'aktiv, it says in the pasuk, ish lefi ochlo, right? It says ish lefi ochlo, according to what you eat. He says, la mitzvah. It's a mitzvah, but it doesn't prevent you from fulfilling the mitzvah. Okay, and the mitzvah means it's better to do it that way, but it's not critical. So now they say, wait a minute, la'akev lo, really? Like they're having a lot of trouble understanding this. V'hatanya, it says in a braita, b'michsat, right? This is b'michsat nefashot. You have to do it according to the number of people. That was the minuyim. This teaches you it has to be slaughtered only for the people who registered. Remember, this is all repeat of what we've learned. Yachol shachato, the braita continues. You might have thought if we slaughter it shelo leminuyav, maybe it's okay. Yeheika over ala mitzvah v'kasher. Maybe you didn't fulfill it the way it's supposed to, but it would still work, just like we're saying right now about the ochlim, the way Rav says. Talmud lomar, but the pasuk comes to teach you that's not the case. Ish lefi ochlo tachosu. That means the person according to who's eating it, meaning the people registered, right? Tachosu. You have to slaughter it in the name of those people. Hakatuf shana alav la'akev. The fact that it repeats it twice, and it says also b'michsat nefashot, and it says ish lefi ochlo. When we repeat things, and we learned this before, that in the world of kodshim, sacrifices, whenever there's a rule, whenever anything is repeated, that means it's critical. It's a necessary element. So if the minuyim are a necessary element, and the minuyim are mentioned in the same verse as the ochlim, the people who can eat it, eat kash ochlim the minuyim. So therefore, we make a comparison, just like it has to be done for the registered people. And if it's not, it's disqualified. Likewise, for people who can eat it. And in this case, since the meat is not edible because it's now impure, no one can eat it, that should be ma'akev. It should prevent you from fulfilling it. So how could Rav possibly have said, if it's hortzah, it's okay? So, Ella Rav de Amar Rabbi Natan. He must hold like a different Tannaitic opinion. Okay, when we have a braita that contradicts an Emora, we can say, first of all, Rav in general has the status, we could say Rav Tanahu Palik. He can disagree with someone. But here they don't want to say that because he's explaining the Mishnah. So it has to work with some Tana. So it must be holds like Rabbi Natan Da'amal Achila Pesachim Lo Ma'akva. Apparently Rabbi Natan holds it's not Ma'akev, the eating. Okay, you can do the Korban Pesach even without it. So now the Gemara wants to know, where did Rabbi Natan say this? Hey, Rabbi Natan. Hey means which. It doesn't mean which Rabbi Natan is, which opinion of Rabbi Natan. Where do we see an opinion of Rabbi Natan like this? And whenever they ask this question, they're going to bring one and reject it, and bring maybe two or three and reject them, until they get to the answer. In this case, they're going to bring two, and the second one's going to be the one. Hey, Rabbi Natan. Which one of Rabbi Natan? Ilema ha Rabbi Natan. Maybe it's this one. Did Tanya, right? They start pulling up Braita. Who knows a Braita of Rabbi Natan that would say the following? Rabbi Natan Omer, Minayin shekol Yisrael yotzim bepesach echad. How do we know that if we're stuck, the entire community can be yotzei on one Pesach? Now, what did we learn? Everyone has to eat a kazayit. How could you possibly do this? Talmud Lomar, it says in the verse, Shachatu oto kol kahal hadat Yisrael ben arbaim. The whole community should slaughter the Korban Pesach in the afternoon. Wait, the entire community doesn't slaughter the Pesach. Why? Because who slaughters it? One representative, usually from each sacrifice, goes to slaughter it. It doesn't mean one, it means one from each group. So what does this verse teach? Comes to teach you that if we're stuck, everyone can be yotzei on one animal. So what do you see here? That's Rabbi Natan, who seems to say you don't have to eat it in order to be yotzei, because here clearly we're not going to all be able to eat it, and yet we can all fulfill our obligation. So they said, no, that one doesn't count. That's not the one, because you could explain it differently. If we do this for all of us, theoretically, its value, it could have been slaughtered for me, because you could have backed out, and then that would give me, each one of us theoretically could eat it as long as other people back out. So because of that, if other people were to back out and find a different animal, it was slaughtered for me, okay, and for you, and right, theoretically it could have been slaughtered for each one of us, and that's why it works. But if it couldn't have been slaughtered for anybody, right, like the meat was tameh, it couldn't be eaten by anybody, then, I should say it couldn't be eaten by anybody, right? That could be eaten by any one of us. That one can't be eaten by anybody because it's tameh, so you wouldn't prove from here that that's what Rabbi Natan holds. Elaha Rabbi Natan, it must be this one. Titania, nimnu alav chavura achat, v'chazru v'nimnu alav chavura acheret. If one group came to register for this animal, and then a different group added themselves to the picture, but there's not enough for everybody. So Rishonim sheyesh lem kazayid ochlinu p'turim elaso Pesach Sheni. So the first group eats the Pesach, right? And the second group has to do Pesach Sheni because there's not enough left for them. Achronim she'en lahem kazayid ein ochlim b'chayvim laso Pesach Sheni. Sorry, I didn't read far enough. But the second group that came in, since there's not enough meat for them, they have to do the Pesach the next month because they didn't fulfill their obligation. Rabbi Natan omer, elu ve'elu p'turim elaso Pesach Sheni shekvar nizrak hadam. The second group can do it because the blood was already poured for them. Okay, so they say, no, you could say the exact same thing here that you did a minute ago. You could say, if I'm in part of the second group, also we could say it was slaughtered for me because theoretically you could have pulled out, you're in the first group, and then I would have been able to eat. So again, theoretically it was for me, and then that wouldn't teach us anything about the case where it's nitma and nobody can eat. So they say, no, you can't say that's what's going on here. Why? Because the Braita tells you why Rabbi Natan thinks this works. And what does he say? Shekfar nizrak hadam, because the blood is already poured. So what does that indicate, right? It's because you already did it. So in Ken Litne, if you wanted to say what you tried to say a minute ago, you would have said, Ho'il ru'yin li mashech. It works because theoretically it was done for you and the other group could have pulled out. So my shekfar nizrak hadam, why does it say that? It sounds like the blood is the most important thing. And even if no one can eat it, it doesn't really matter. And therefore they prove it from that opinion of Rabbi Natan. But now they ask about Rav. Why was Rav, if this is only Rabbi Natan's opinion, remember, the Mishnah said, nitma, if the basar is nitma, right, you can't sprinkle the blood. Came Rav and he said, well, that's l'chatchila, but b'diavad, if you did, it's fine. Why? And that only fits with Rabbi Natan because he's the only one who holds achila is not ma'akev. So why would he do that? Why wouldn't he just say the Mishnah's l'chatchila, like Tanakama, and I'm sorry, the Mishnah's even b'diavad. That's no matter what, it doesn't work, as that's what Tanakama says. So it seems weird that he's saying the Mishnah's only l'chatchila, b'diavad, if you did it, it works, and that only fits with Rabbi Natan. It's a bit strange. So they say, and this is a linguistic answer, manitin kashite. Amai tani ein zoreket adam, litnei pasul. It says in the Mishnah, don't sprinkle the blood. Don't sprinkle the blood sounds like l'chatchila. It doesn't say it's pasul, the korban's disqualified. If they wanted to say it doesn't even work b'diavad, it would have said disqualified. The fact that they didn't choose that language comes to show that it's not the case. Ela shma mina ein zorek l'chatchila, aval diavad shapridam. One last question about Rabbi Natan or the Rabbi Natan. Ish l'fiach lo lamali. What does he do with that verse? So he says, you need the person needs to be able to eat. He says the whole thing about ochlim is what we learned before. You can't slaughter it for people who are sick and can't eat because they're sick or elderly, but you can slaughter it, right? An elderly person who can't possibly eat anymore, but you can slaughter it if the meat is right. B'diavad, if the meat is no good, it's not focusing on the meat, it's focusing on the people. And it even says ish lefi ochlo. The focus is on the person, not on the meat. So now they're going to bring a few brightot and try to say, who does this brighta fit with, Rabbi Natan or the rabbis? Man tana lahaditanu Rabbanan. Who's the author of this brighta? Shachatol ochlav v'zarko damo shelo ochlav. Hapesach atzmo kasher v'adam yotzei bo yedei chovato. So if you slaughtered it for the ochlav, and then so basically you had the right intent, and then you sprinkle the blood with intent of of people who can't eat. Either the people in the interim became sick and no one could eat, or maybe you had the wrong intent. Okay, your mind wandered. HaPesach atzmo kasher, it works. So this sounds like Rabbi Natan, that the eating is not ma'akev. Keman yema Rabbi Natani v'lo Rabbanan. They say no. Afilu tema Rabbanan em machshevet ochlim bezrika. Remember we said it says in the pasuk ish lefi ochlo tachusu. Tachusu means to slaughter. The whole thing of the people is in the time of the slaughtering, not in the time of sprinkling the blood. That doesn't matter. So if it was done properly at the time of slaughtering, that makes it okay even according to the rabbis, and therefore this isn't necessarily only like Rabbi Natan. Second source. Man tana lahaditanu Rabbanan. So who's the author of this one? Harei shayach choleh Bishat shchita, v'chalim bishat zrika. He was sick in the time of shchita, he couldn't eat. But then he became better by the time they sprinkled the blood. Or chalim bishat shchita, v'chola bishat zrika, or the reverse. Or, right, they say, Ein shochatim v'zorkin alav ad she'eh chalim bishat shchita v'ad shat zrika. You have to be healthy and able to eat from the beginning of the slaughtering until the end of the sprinkling. Kiman, Nema Rabbanan, he below Rabbi Natan. Again, it sounds like the rabbis are not Rabbi Natan because Rabbi Natan would say it doesn't, right? We're lenient. So they say no, afilu tema Rabbi Natan, and this is what we saw before, gavra dechazi lachila be'inan. He still needs the person. His whole thing is the meat. If the meat can't be eaten, it's okay. But the person, as we said before, ish lafiach lo tachosu, has to be done for people who can actually eat. Last source, and we'll finish with this. Man tana lahad tana Rabbanan, shachato b'tahara v'achar kach nitmu abalim. You slaughtered it where the meat was tahor, and then nitmu haba. The people were tahor. And then all of a sudden, what happened? After Shechita, some Gadol Ador dies and everybody goes to the funeral, right? As it happened last week. And all these people go to the funeral, become Tameh, in between the Shechita and the Zrika. You can sprinkle the blood, but you can't eat the meat. Kiman, Amar Rabbi Lazar, this must be Rabbi Natan, right? This is a source of debate between Rabbi Natan and the rabbis. Comes Rabbi Lazar and he says, right? And it's Rabbi Natan who says, even though the meat can't be eaten, you can still do the sprinkling of the blood. For Rabbi Yochanan Amar, afilu tema Rabbanan ki hacha b'mayaskina b'tzibor da'afilu b'tumanami avde. They say, oh no, this is b'tzibor. This is the classic case of tumah b'tzibor. And then even the people can do it. But they say, wait a minute, something doesn't match there. Remember we learned about Pesach Shabbat b'tumah? The people can also eat it. And this says the people can't. So b'tzibor, amai ena b'sar nechal b'tumah. So they say, this is a weird case because the people became tameh in between the shechita and the zrika. If it's before shechita, then we let them all eat. In this case, we don't let them eat. Why is that? Because it might cause confusion next year. Let's say next year, all the people become tameh after zrika. Now that case is not a Pesach haba b'tumah. The Pesach was b'tahara. The people can't eat it. So they're worried that if they allow this case, people will confuse that case. So they'll say, maybe next year, they'll become tameh after the blood was sprinkled, and they'll say, Eshtake, last year we remember lo nitmeinu, we weren't tameh when the shechita happened. Ve'achalnu, hashtanami nechol. This year also we should be allowed to eat. And in that case, they're not allowed to eat. V'lo yade, and they won't remember the ishtake ki izdarik dam balim tmeim havu, hashta balim torim havu, and they won't remember that these cases are a little different, and it'll confuse them. That's one answer. Tomorrow we'll see another answer, and we'll finish here for today. Shavua tov, everyone.